I was asked to talk about comics from Finland, Finnish comics. And next to Sweden, my colleague there, Fredrik Strömberg, will talk about Swedish comics after me. Actually, wasn't it? Yes. And so I suppose there will be some visual things that are common, some historical things that are common. I will talk a few minutes about the history of Finnish comics very briefly, just to show where we have come from, and perhaps also to show the roots for Finnish comics that are rather similar to most European countries. And after that I will focus on contemporary Finnish comics. There will be also a small exhibition on Finnish and Swedish comics. He knows better where it is, but it's close, isn't it?
Yep.
Yes. Well, starting from the history, there are a few basic things to say about the history of visual storytelling in Finland. Some references that are somewhat common all over Europe. One of them being, of course, religious art and sort of comic-like storytelling in those. This example is from a wooden church, small church in northern Finland called Haukipudas, and it's filled with images, filled with drawings of the time. It was built in the 18th century, and if you have imagination, you can easily think about it as a comic strip or canvas of all sorts of visual storytelling. All the stories are combined as they religiously are. And other references come from European caricature press and even European predecessors of graphic novels, like in here, Rotundy, German artist who was already translated in Finland in the 1850s, so 170 years ago, and I guess about the same time in Sweden as well. And it's very early example of actually quite modern storytelling with images. Third example of early roots are American newspaper strips that were translated quite early. In Finland, this book is from 1904, so 120 years ago. It was containing American newspaper strips. And last example is of course German tradition. Artists like Wilhelm Busch, Heinrich Hoffmann, etc. that were doing sort of children's stories, Bildergeschichte tradition. And all of those very influencing Finnish comic storytelling 100 years ago. Early example being in here, Pekka Puupää. I would say that it's pretty typical humor comics of the time, containing situational comedy, humor, comedy, slapstick, but still very connected to the time of the 1920s, 1930s, political topics of the time. Also, a big part of the time were so-called silent comics, comics having no words at all, or having very few words. but when talking about or rather small size, when talking about Finnish comics on more, say, international level, 1950s was rather interesting time. Commercially speaking, in Finland it was not very successful for comics, but those who maintained were international successes. I have two examples. Other one is Moomin by Tove and Lars Jansson. I think even still Moomin is best known for novels of Tove Jansson and perhaps the animation series. However, the comics that was published from 1954 to the late 70s, maybe 75, for 20 years, first drawn by Tove Jansson and then her brother Lars, is a great example of classic that almost got lost. Moomin is very well known nowadays, but still 20 years ago, even among professionals, hardly anyone knew outside Nordic countries, hardly anyone knew that such thing existed as Moomin comics. But when Canadian Roland Quarterly publisher started publishing collections, when was it, say 15-20 years ago, it all changed and now it's internationally well known. Other example is of a time is Tom Finland. At the time, homosexuality was forbidden basically in Finland. And Tom of Finland is a pseudonym of Touko Laaksonen, and the artist was drawing them straight to Denmark and United States. And the aesthetics changed a bit. Some of his comics, some of his illustrations were more ad agency type of drawing, very detailed type of illustrations, sort of photorealism in a way. Some were more close to underground type of comic style, as this one. However, if we talk about history of Finnish comics, in my eyes the more interesting things began as usually in most Western countries after 68, after the half of the 1960s, when new youth culture, new revolutionary type of culture took place, and with comics it meant that more and more artists were considering comics as a different type of form of expression as before. More and more artists and activists were thinking of comics as an art form that actually has some sort of aesthetics, some sort of history, and some sort of community that has an identity. And in many countries it meant that new magazines were founded, new organizations, events were built, and they're still working in one way or another, and new type of aesthetics, new type of artists. In Finland, the first wave underground movement was strong, but in comics it was less influential than the next waves. By which I mean mainly 1970s, 1980s, do-it-yourself type of movement that came out of punk rock and zine culture. In 70s and 80s, a lot of Finnish comics Finnish artists started to build their aesthetics on new magazines that were published a few times a year, for 4 times most of the times, and new generation, mainly born in 50s and 60s and later 70s, they finally had a chance to try new aesthetics. They were hardly paid anything at all, but it was new form, new type of expression. And most of the artists in 70s and 80s, comics artists, they started with short stories, but with the time, with decades, as all over, stories have become longer, and book form, graphic novels, etc. have taken place. And same has happened in Finland. In my eyes, maybe from about starting from 1990s, perhaps early beginning of this millennium, some sort of golden era has been going on in Finnish comics, and it's based on 2 types of expression, 2 types of genres in very broad sense. First of all, it has been, at least for quite a while, it has been golden era was for newspaper strips. Last 5 or 10 years have not been so strong, but if we take longer perspective of time, at least 15 years were quite strong. Before 1990s, there were hardly any newspaper comic strips in Finnish newspaper comic strips in Finland. 95% of everything that was published in newspapers was from the syndicates, from mostly American syndicates, and there were not that many domestic comics. But it changed, and mostly because new generation of artists that had started from the in the 80s and started working with low circulation publications. Now they were ready to draw with bit underground style to newspapers. One example being here, Bibi and Wagner. That's about a relationship of a woman and animal. And another one being Fingerpori, in which you can see very graphically, very underground type of drawing. Both have been highly successful and are still published in dozens of newspapers in Finland. I think still in maybe 40 different newspapers. However, the other stream of Finnish comics, if the other one is the newspaper strips, then the other one is very strongly connected with graphic novels and book publishing in general. I think it applies with Finnish comics as well as internationally, that last 20 years has been strong move towards book publishing and drawing comics straight to books. And sure, there's also internet publishing, but I'm not talking about that. Book publishing has been both commercially and aesthetically very strong. And what I think has maybe not been talked that much is that when comics have been getting closer to book publishing, it has also meant that mostly all of the genres that exist in books, in prose, non-fiction, etc. also now exist in contemporary comics. It means there's poetry-like of expression. It means there are children's comics, there are children's books that take a lot of influence from comics or mix written prose and comics-like expression quite freely. There are travel stories, there's journalism, there's non-fiction, there are biographies, and of course history, all sorts, mythology. I would say all the comics have, in the nuance level, they have taken over the classical classification of published literature, and it's interesting. What it means in Finland? Well, it means that you can also divide Finnish production of comics by looking same types of genres or forms of expression as in literature. First of all, let's take a more experimental type of literature. In classical literature you have short stories, all sorts of fragmented expression, poetry, etc. And in that context of Finnish comics, I could show a few examples. Here's an example of Matti Hagelberg, who's been drawing since the 1980s. First mainly or only by scrapeboard, sort of graphics type of expression, and lately more and more he's been using text mark pens. And his stories, his longer stories consist of fragments, and his short stories, as well as long stories, are consisting. They get quite close to, as I interpret postmodern literature, filled with references of all kinds. Some of them to popular culture, some of them to classic highbrow art, and also the mythology, such as in here. This page is from Läski Moses, Fat Moses, which is actually it's a high-tech story, but it's also very grandiose story of a history of mankind and history of Finland written wrong. It's very in same level, very funny, very nuanced, and very surprising type of storytelling. Sometimes it gets close to some kind of Jack Kirby drugs or whatever, and sometimes it gets closer to Finnish mythology. And if you know your mythology, then you also know that the references are quite accurate and sort of deranged. Another way of taking mythology into its place Maria Hokoivu, Finnish artist living in Denmark at the moment. She did, well, 5 or 10 years ago, how would I remember? She did a book called Oksi, that is also about old Finnish mythology, stories of bears and men, and stylistically very different compared to what Matti Agerberg has been doing, for instance. At least for me, that's one characteristic of Finnish comics. It's graphically very versatile, a lot of styles, a lot of types of storytelling. As to apart from mythology, a lot of artists, as in literature as well, use history as their material. Finnish history, especially Finnish history, of course. Here's example of Hanna-Riina Moisainen. She's been doing comics, some of her comics, all of her comics are somehow connected with the concept of memory, either in collective level or in individual level. This book is called Kannas, and it's about Second World War time. Basically, it tells a story of women and interaction of women and animals, and how they both end up being refugees when Russians take over. And since the theme is very fragile, Hanna-Riina's style is quite sensitive as well. She works a lot with pencils. Another example, quite a recent example of how to use history as material to telling what's happening now is Taika by Sanna Hukkanen. Her graphic novel is it's basically an autofiction type of story, telling historical interaction of Finland and all the small linguistic groups and nations within Soviet Union. There are quite a lot of Finno-Ugric languages in the area of former Soviet Union, and she's basically telling about the history of the very small cultures living inside very big culture. And she started drawing it about 5 years ago, and while drawing the story, war escalated in Ukraine. All the interaction between cultural organizations in Finland and Russia were more or less cut. So it's basically very up-to-date type of story, and again visually quite different type of storytelling. few more examples of striking visual storytellers. For instance, Tommi Musturi is here as a guest as well. His book Future was just published in Polish as well as in many other languages as well. And this example is from his earlier book, Samuel, and with many of his earlier books, they are graphically striking, but still not minimalistic, but not telling too much, focusing on some aspect more. Here with Future is rather a different book compared to, for instance, Samuel, in the sense that it consists of different type of storytelling fragments. There are some examples that go close to newspaper strips type of storytelling. Some go quite close to comic book type of storytelling. Some are closer to quite free contemporary expression. Here, for instance, the basic form is of a very classic newspaper strip page. However, if you actually start reading it, you notice that it consists of very different types of comments on contemporary society, remarks on what's going on, even quite strong political activism, I would say, and especially when it mixes storytelling that has, for instance, children as characters and still saying rather political things. I'd say that it gets quite close to sort of situationist movement of the 1960s, when they were using comics as one form of political storytelling. Here, visually very different type of example of the future. It gets closer to type of artists like Fred in France. Again, here's one-page excerpt from a fragment that tells about artists that are hardly visible in society at all anymore. They're under those booths, actually, in the basement. Yet another example of visually striking stories. I think this one by Marko Turunen has not been translated outside of Finland, or if it has, maybe in France actually, called Kotolan mies ja Loinen. He also has quite fragmented way of telling stories, striking a bit weird colors. But stories are very often, they are not autofiction, but they are very often about normal life with aliens or animals or whatever. I think I I have been concentrating on showing quite visual examples, quite experimental examples of Finnish comics. I think basically it's because commercial comics scene in Finland is not that strong, and that means that you probably wouldn't live by doing science fiction, usual, regular type, conventional science fiction comic. But with some sort of art, you can express yourself anyway. There are some examples of artists that go somewhere in between, or have the type of style that basically the style could be from any country in the world. Here is an artist called Mika Liitsen who has very sort of ligne claire type of expression, very clear lines, clear colors, very simple yet refined storytelling. This graphic novel is called Alkohol. That's very Finnish theme, of course. And the story is quite brutal. I think the ligne claire style and brutal story is interesting mix. Somehow you feel that does it really fit? But yes, it does. It's good storytelling. Here's another example by same artist. Book is called Death Metal. Well, it's as you can see in the page, it's a story of a band, young people forming a band and bad things happening. And again, style is very not nuanced, but well taught. Music and especially heavy music is a big part of Finnish culture, actually, even still. And perhaps because of that, one of the internationally quite well-known examples of Finnish comics is Belzebuks by J.P. Ahonen. It has been published a lot in the internet and in the book collections in various languages, I think 5 or 6. And it's a type of mixture of cuteness and making fun of horror and band cliches, Addams Family type of weird family, metalhead family. Black metalhead, thank you. And his style is classical black and white style. He knows his shit, as we say in Finland. Again, sort of humor that comes out of mixing weird and mixing very mundane things. Okay. As I said first, the selection of publication of there's quite a lot of different types of Finnish comics, and some genres are even a bit surprising, perhaps. At least they would have been 15 years ago. I'll take one example. One interesting global theme that has occurred in last 10 years ago has been non-fiction comics, and meaning the type of literature that has strong sense of storytelling and still strong base on facts, strong lean on facts, and that type of non-fiction comics have been published a little bit in Finland at least. And one example in here is called Vihan ja inhon internet, Internet of Hate and Repulsion, and it's about hate speech in the internet. It's about how women are being attacked in the internet. It's how they are bullied, or also a bit in general how the internet works as a mechanism for bullying and all kinds of shitstorming in general. And here's an interesting example of two artists working together. One being a writer, Johanna Vehko. She's a quite well-known Finnish journalist who's been writing a lot about fake news, for instance, and also about questions such as hate speech. And the book consists of interviews that she did with the artist Emmi Nieminen, and manages to somehow mix quite a lot of text with visual images, sort of metaphors, storytelling. It was published in Finland. It was published in quite large style, quite large size, and big format, album type of format, big book. And that was a good idea. It makes it easier to read despite the amount of text, and you can really feel the images and sort of visual metaphors. And to me personally, I think maybe the non-fiction part of what's been going on in comics in general, it's one of the biggest phenomena lately. I've been really interested in it, how you can visualize your text, how you can mix facts with some type of fiction, either autofiction or other forms of storytelling, how you can perhaps be more investigative in your non-fiction or comics journalism. Unfortunately, there are not that many books in this genre in Finland, but for instance in France there are quite a lot of books and also some regularly published magazines like Revue Dessinée that are actually specializing in comics journalism, and of course some stories are well, let's say better and more interesting visually than the others. However, I think I'll leave the stage, I'll give it to my dear colleague, and if you have questions, I think we have just about a few minutes if there's something you need to know. And I know I didn't I didn't show the names of the artists. If you're interested in hearing more about someone, I can sure tell more after this show anyway. But if you have questions, please be free to ask. Yes.
Are there any movie adaptations of Finnish comics?
Movie adaptations of Finnish comics? Not too much. There's an adaptation of Fingerpori comic it's the most famous newspaper strip, and actually even though it's a newspaper strip, still they made it as a movie adaptation. They were just mixing hundreds of strips, and it was sort of funny film. And there are some historical examples of course, but when talking about contemporary Finnish comics, I think not much. But then again, the Berse books that I was showing earlier about the black metal band family, there's some animated films there. But like feature films, I don't think so. Well, thank you very much.